Today's episode is sponsored by Shooting Star Saddlery in Nyarata, Montana. Jeff Morrow is the man behind Shooting Star Saddlery, and he's been making custom saddles, chaps, tack, and gun leather since the 1980s. Take a look at his website and you'll see that he can make just about anything you can think of out of leather. Jeff told me recently that I just really love good leather and making lasting products for the best people in the world, my customers. You can see Jeff's leather work and place orders at shootingstar.montana.com. I'd like to start today's show with a poem that today's guest mentioned hearing on ranches in New Mexico about 40 years ago. This is The Legend of Boastful Bill by Charles Badger Clark. At a roundup on the Healy one sweet morning long ago, 10 of us was throwed right freely by a horse from Idaho. And we thought he'd go a-begging for a man to break his pride, till a hitching up one leggin', Boastful Bill cut loose and cried, "I'm an ornery proposition for to hurt. I fulfill my earthly mission with a quirt. I can ride the highest liver 'tween the Gulf and Powder River, and I'll break this thing as easy as I'd flirt." So Bill climbed the Northern Fury, and they mangled up the air till a native of Missouri would have owned his brag was fair. Though the plunges kept him reelin', and the wind it flapped his shirt, loud above the horses squealin', we could hear our friend assert, "I'm the one to take such rakin's as a joke. Someone hand me up the makin's of a smoke. If you think my fame needs brightening, why I'll rope a streak of lightning, and I'll cinch him up and spur him till he's broke." Then one caper of repulsion broke that horse's back in two. Cinches snapped in the convulsion, skyward man and saddle flew. Up he mounted, never lagging, while we watched him through our tears, and his last thin bit of bragging come a-droppin' to our ears. If you'd ever watched my habits very close, you would know I broke such rabbits by the gross. I have kept my talent hidin'. I'm too good for earthly riding, and I'm off to bust the lightnings. Adios. Years have gone since that ascension. Boastful Bill ain't never lit, so he reckoned that he's a-wrenchin' some celestial outlaw's bit. And when the night rain beats our slickers, and the wind is swift and stout, and the lightning flares and flickers, we can sometimes hear him shout, "I'm a bronco-twistin' wonder on the fly. I'm the riding son of thunder of the sky. Ha, you earthlings, shut your winders while we're rippin' clouds to flinders. If this blue-eyed darlin' kicks at you, you die." Stardust on his chaps and saddle, scornful still of jar and jolt. He'll come back someday astraddle of a bald-faced thunderbolt. And the thin-skinned generation of that dim and distant day sure will stare with admiration when they hear old Boastful say, "I was first, as old rawhiders all confessed. Now I'm last of all rough riders, and the best. You soft and dainty floaters, with your aeroplanes and motors, are you the great-grandchildren of the West?" Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is R.W. Hampton. R.W. is a cowboy, songwriter, actor, and singer. I've known R.W. since the early 1990s when I was about 14 years old, and I met R.W. in the parking lot of the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. He gave me a cassette tape right out of his pocket and signed it for me, and we've been friends ever since. I recently sat down with R.W. on his ranch outside of Cimarron, New Mexico, and recorded this interview. Here's R.W. Hampton.
Yeah, well, I was a Texas town kid, and my parents that grew up during the World War II years, they, back then, after the Depression, it was all about going to college, and so they came. Their families were both from really strong agricultural backgrounds. My dad was from up around Sherman, Denison, Grayson County, Texas. His grandfather was a horse and mule trader. Worked a lot out of the Fort Worth stockyards. My mother was born in Orange, Texas, way down on the Sabine River, in the deep piney woods of East Texas, and her daddy was a county agricultural agent in the early, I think probably in the very start of that program. But my dad had been in the Air Force, and then when he got out, we lived in Sherman for a while, and then we eventually moved north to Dallas, and that's where most of my growing up was. I had a horse that we kept on the edge of town, and I'd ride my bicycle out there, and catch my horse and ride, and so that was a big part of my growing up. I was involved in scouting. Part of the scouting experience, and still is today, if you have the opportunity, is to come to the Philmont Scout Ranch, which you can look out here and see that whole Sangre de Cristo range out there that makes up that 137,000 acres of Philmont. I went out there as a camper in 1972. And it was back out there early in the season with my Troop 1001, Circle 10 Council. In 74, we were hiking to this place where we were going to camp, and I heard a bunch of hooping and hollering, and I could hear horses running. And all of a sudden they broke through the trees, and I think there were probably 75 head of loose horses, and these two cowboys chasing these horses. And I was there hiking along single file with my scout troop, and I had a straw hat on, and on the back of my backpack I had a pair of cowboy boots tied on. That was kind of my camp shoes. When I got to camp, I'd pull those old sweaty hiking boots on, put on my cowboy boots, and they were real comfortable, I thought. And but anyhow, they rode past me, and they looked and saw me and said, "Are you going to be here a little bit?" And I said, "Yeah, we're just hiking up here to this camp." And they said, "Well, we're going to pen these horses, and we'll come back and talk to you." So they did, and they penned their horses, and they came back and found me. They asked me where I was from, and they said, they asked me two questions. They said, "You kind of look like you might be a horse person. Do you have experience with horses?" And I said, "Yeah, I do. I got a horse." They said, "Well, the other question is, are you an Eagle Scout?" I said, "Yes, I am." Well, back in those days, in the early to mid-'70s, it was preferred if you worked there to be an Eagle Scout, no matter what department that you would work in. One of the things when Wade Phillips, he was one of the 5 Phillips brothers from Phillips Petroleum, when Wade Phillips gave all that country to the Scouts back in 1938, already back then he thought that young men were running out of wild places to roam and camp and make fires and fish and everything. And so when he gave that to the Scouts, one of the little conditions, there weren't many, but one of the conditions was that it remain a working ranch. And and so they said, "Have you got any experience with horses?" "Yes." "Are you an Eagle Scout?" "Yes." "Well, we're a man short. We could use you." And I said, "Well, I don't know how to get from, how do we make that happen?" And they said, "Well, go on to where you're camping with your scout troop, and we'll send someone over to talk to you." And so a man came over in the evening that was kind of the superintendent of this campground that was in these ponderosa pines up there. And there was a place where he lived in a horse barn and corrals, and he talked to my scoutmaster and said, "You've got a man here, a young man. He's 16, turned 17. would it be okay if we took him tonight to meet the livestock foreman of the ranch to talk about a job? And my scoutmaster said, sure, if it's okay with him. And man, I was ready to go. So anyhow, the way it all shook out is that I finished my 10-day trek with my scout troop and never went home. They got a hold of my folks through made some kind of a correspond or an agreement, and so I was glad I had my boots and my hat with me. And part of what we did was we wrangled horses. They had about 300 head of horses there. We took care of the shoeing and all that, and part of our job was to take these kids. Many of them had never seen a horse up close, and had never been on a horse, and take them on these mountain trails, And the part of it was dealing with the livestock that Wade Phillips had left, for it to remain a working ranch. So I worked there the summer of '74, '75, and I graduated from high school in '75. And I know my folks were hoping I would go to college, but man, I had the cowboy bug. So I went back out to work the summer of '76. I think that they had hoped that would kind of fulfill that part of my life and move on, to maybe a little more of a conventional type of, what they had in mind for their blue-eyed baby boy. But something happened to me when those guys came by driving those horses, and their spurs were ringing and their wild rags were popping. They had big black hats, and it's one of those things that I remember. I want to be what they are is what I want to be. And music was always really important to me as a listener. But really early on, it was to be a cowboy. In my circle of people circle of riding men, as Joel Nelson would say, I started meeting more and more cowboys, and a lot of them were, to me, they were giants in my mind. They were, but old guys that were 25 years old, that had a lot of experience. But I just talked to them. I say, man, I want to go punch cows somewhere. Where do I go? And I'd met some of the boys from the Bell Ranch, and so I wandered over that way, And I could have continued to work at Philmont, but I felt like, that there was more for me to see, and more for me to see and do. I think, if I remember correctly, that I had that sense that what I was chasing wasn't going to be around that long. And it's still around. It's changed, but at 19, 20 years old, I heard about the big outfits that pulled out a wagon in the spring and fall. That's what I wanted to do. And I also knew that I could work for some really nice family ranches, for some really nice people, and I'd be doing all kinds of stuff, but I wanted back then we used to call it a straight riding job. Straight up riding job. Only hay I'd be handling is what we threw to my horses to feed them in the evening, And that's not to say I was too good to do the other stuff, but that's what I wanted to focus on. To go back a little bit, my folks didn't play music. My mom played the piano a little bit. Most of the music that they sang revolved around our church. But one of the things that we had in our home was we always, at supper time, we put on a record. And my dad's only requirement was that it was not so loud we couldn't talk above it. And we had such broad musical taste, everything from Jimmy Rogers to Frank Sinatra, and right at that time, Merle Haggard he was a guy that my whole family liked, and Charlie Pride, Sonny James, and people like that, Johnny Cash. I had gotten an old guitar. In fact, I've got it in there. It's an old it was Sears made them, Harmony, a Harmony guitar. Mm-hmm. And I had gotten a guitar, learned G, C, and D.
How old were you when you got that first guitar?
I was 13. When I was 14 years old, we were traveling down, it was Easter time, we were traveling down to deep East Texas to spend Easter with my mother's folks. We're just driving down the highway. It's amazing how life can change in the blink of an eye. But 3 drunks ran a stop sign and we hit them broadside. And it killed all 3 of them, and it banged everybody up in the car, and my sister died. She was 9 years old. And so our home became, as you can imagine, just very, very sad. So I would just go back to my room and get that guitar and go to playing it, When I left out to be a cowboy, the guitar went with me. I never was very good at playing cards or doing those, a lot of times there were card games in the evening. But I just get that guitar and play the guitar. And so it seemed like the guitar and my saddle were, kind of my 2 buddies. When I was working for the Spade Ranch, and they had a division in New Mexico and one in Colorado City, Texas, and the offices were out of Lubbock. And Dub Waldrop was the general manager, and he would come up for spring roundup and fall works, and he had an old mandolin he'd bring with him. We'd sit around the bunkhouse in the evening and play. It's funny how life goes in circles, because he said, "R.W., we're going to have an event. It's the first one they've ever had. It's going to be in Lubbock. It's called the Golden Spur Awards. And there's an old cowman by the name of Albert K. Mitchell. And his favorite song in the whole world is Little Joe the Wrangler." He said, "I know you do that. Would you come to Lubbock and do that song?" And I said, "Well, yeah, if you'll tell James if we ain't doing too much, and he'll let me." And I remember that was kind of funny, because Dub said, "Well, I think I can get you off. I am the manager of this place, So anyhow, I went to Lubbock. It's funny because I actually do not remember where that event happened. I think it was on the Texas Tech campus. But there was probably 500 people of ranching who's who, especially from Texas. Bridwells, Birdwells, the Klebergs, and the name went on, and Wittenbergs, and, people I'd always heard of, and they were giants to me, cowmen, and their families and wives. And when I went out there and I played Little Joe the Wrangler, something happened. Something turned in me right then. Nothing changed in my life. I went back and loaded my stuff, I went back. That was on Saturday night. I went back on Sunday, and Monday morning I was back in the saddle. Them old cows we would take care of didn't care much about what I'd done. That was my first time, and something really, really turned in me. I don't know that I was that conscious of it. Well, certainly, I certainly wasn't. Didn't have any idea where the trail of life would lead, But my dad was really good, because growing up in high school, he did 2 things that I know that he probably would have rather not done. One, I was haul me to high school rodeos as a competitor. And the other, if there was a concert I was interested in, he would take me. And he took me to see Johnny Cash. And I mean, Cash had everybody. He had the Statler brothers. He had, the Carters, the Mother Maybelle and the sisters, and the Tennessee Three, and I'm just, whoa. He took me to see Merle Haggard. Took me to see Merle at the State Fair Music Hall. I don't know why. Something happened, and it amazed me. And he was playing all these songs with the strangers. It was amazing. And I was on the edge of my seat. And then he said, "I'm going to play a song that a lot of folks like. And I'm going to do it a little different tonight." And I remember he turned around to his band, and he just waved them off. And he had that Martin guitar, and he played "Sing Me Back Home." I think I realized then what the power of music was, you know. I think it was entertainment. I think that there was emotions tied to it. But when Merle sang that, I think there was about 10,000 people there. And you could have literally heard a pin drop, you know. And I remember being amazed at being able to do that. That memory still does something to me. It was just, and I think probably subconsciously there was something happened in me where I thought, you know, Lord willing, I'd like to be able to do that someday. You know, I've often heard it said, long after people have left your presence, they may not remember what you said or how you said it, but they remember how you made them feel, you know. And that's what I remembered, that Merle took those people to that moment. Just him and his guitar. Him and his guitar. And when I went to work at Spade Ranch, we didn't have TV or anything like that. We had an old adobe bunkhouse, but I had one of those old kind of a suitcase-looking record players. And I had my, I took some albums with me. And one of the ones I took was my Gunfighter Ballads and Trail songs. I got to listen to those songs of Marty. You know, I grew up here in the streets of Laredo and Red River Valley, Utah, Carroll, and some of those. But I got to looking at some of the ones that were my favorites, and he had written them. And I thought, well, there's no reason why I can't write songs about what I'm doing. And so that's kind of where I got the idea.
In the liner notes to R.W.'s 1997 album, Riding the Dreamland Range, Cowboy singer Don Edwards said this: "What does a cowboy sing? Any dad-blamed thing he feels like singing. Whether it be trail songs and ballads of the old-time cowboy, popular songs, or songs of the silver screen. R.W. Hampton is a real working cowboy who happens to have the talent to sing whatever suits his fancy."
One of my dearest and oldest friends is Don Edwards, and he had already done such a marvelous job of, as you have, of pulling these wonderful old songs out and making them new for us. I decided at some point, and it was at a radio interview, because people would ask me about the same thing you're asking, that I would be a cowboy who sang and not a singer who just did cowboy songs. And one time, Doug Green from Riders in the Sky had sent me some recordings. I think they were on cassette. They were old transcripts of the Gene Autry show. And he was doing his silver screen cowboy stuff, but he was also doing Red Sails on the Sunset and You Belong to Me and doing things with Joe Stafford. And I thought, well, if you can do it, why not? I think my appreciation for music, and Don Edwards and I used to talk about this, that cowboys, you know, not only sang songs about their work, their job, but they sang the popular songs, Tin Pan Alley songs of the day. Years ago, I was working for the old Quien Sabe Ranch out of Channing, Texas. And it was at the Fall Wagon. We had a kid join us from Arizona named Jimmy Gerald. I don't know where Jimmy is. Jimmy, if you hear this, get in touch with me. I'd love to shake your hand. There was Fro and Jim Bob Walden and Jimmy Gerald, and they worked for the Babbitt Ranch out in Arizona, and they drifted in the panhandle there on the Canadian River. Someone said, "Jimmy, do that song." And Jimmy didn't play the guitar or anything, but I remember he leaned up against that wagon by that water barrel, and he reared back. He had the real pretty tenor voice. I mean, it just crystal clear. And he sang Peaceful, Easy Feeling. That was a cowboy song for us. I want to sleep with you in the desert tonight with a million stars all around. That was a cowboy song for us, and never mentioned being on a horse, punching a cow, or roping anything, but it was a cowboy song. It had something in there that meant a lot to us. You know, I recognized it as an Eagles song there were some old cowboys there that, we're talking about men that were pretty tough old men. There was one old cowboy there by the name of Roy Mitchell. He was over around Spearman, Texas. He had been in World War II. Got his ship sunk out from under him and caught by the Japanese and everything. And he had been married and lost his wife and this, that, and the other. But he understood that song too. It's kind of a loneliness. I found out a long, long time ago what a woman can do to your soul. But she can't take you anywhere. You already know how to go, And that was just, it was, I always remember that because I understood it, but the older guys understood it. So I realized then a cowboy song can be whatever the cowboy sings. I remember, and it always happened at roundup time, and it was, if roundup was going to, say during the fall, if it was going to last maybe a month long, and it was customary, a lot of the neighbors would drive their horses over from the neighboring ranches and throw in with our horses. There was always, I'm going to say maybe the first 3 or 4 nights when people would be telling stories on each other, or maybe last year at this time. And as we got further into roundup, eventually the singing and the poetry reciting ended. Everyone just wanted to eat supper and climb in their bed because 4 o'clock in the morning came early. But yeah, I remember Boastful Bill was recited a lot. And the Strawberry Roan was recited and sung. And it was interesting because of the folk tradition. I might do Strawberry Roan, and some guy'd say, well, that's pretty good, but I tell you what, I'm from Montana, and this is the real way it's done. This is the way we did it up there. And so, well, and there'd be another verse or something that I'd never heard of. I remember the first time I heard Alaska. Blew me away, What a story. And so...
Who did you hear? Was that... just another cowboy?
Just another cowboy. It was another guy. I don't know why, but it seemed like they were all from Arizona. And that may have been, a coincidence, But somehow they had learned. They loved Boastful Bill, and there's one called High Chin Bob about roping a mountain lion, And of course, Sorry Pete's. And there was not just a whole bunch of them, but maybe there was 5 or 6, that people kind of knew. And what was interesting, that you'd see the cowboys moving their lips, they would kind of be, because they'd heard it so many times, kind of following along with it.
There's a song on R.W.'s 2001 album, Always in My Heart, entitled When She Cries, Don't Go, that was co-written by R.W. and the legendary Ian Tyson. Tyson also appears on the album as a harmony vocalist. I asked R.W. to talk about his history with Ian Tyson.
Kurt Marcus has really been instrumental in my life, and every time I try to tell him how much I appreciate it, he kind of blows it off. He called me one time. He was the editor of Western Horseman. He had come down to the Quien Sabe there out of Channing where I worked and followed us around for a number of weeks, and he and I had become good friends. And he called me up one time. He said, you ever heard of Ian Tyson? I said, you bet I have. He said, well, tell me what you know about him. I said, well, I don't know him, but I know 4 Strong Winds. I know Someday Soon. I know Summer Wages. And he said, well, how do you know about him? And I guess Kurt was just really inquisitive. And I said, well, growing up in Texas, on Saturday evenings, if I had all my work done, I'd turn on the country music TV shows. And there was a Tommy Hunter show, and there was the Marty Robbins Spotlight, and there was Porter Wagner and the Buck Owens out of Bakersfield. But there was also 2 folk shows. There was Hootenanny and a Shindig. and I'd seen Ian and Sylvia on them, and I really liked their sound. And I guess what he was alluding to me was, he said, well, I've just met this Ian Tyson, and he said, to be honest with you, I was not that familiar with him, but I understand he's kind of like Willie Nelson is down here up in Canada. I said, yeah. And then he says, well, Ian and his wife are going to be here. I gave him a cassette tape that you gave me, and he'd really like to meet you. And so anyhow, I went and I stayed at Kurt and Maria's house there in the out east of Colorado Springs. And Ian and his lady at the time, Twyla, were there. I was prone to being a little bit starstruck back then. I'm sure I was a kid in tall boots and a big hat, was a little socially awkward, but I was just amazed at somebody that could write those kind of songs. And so he says, we were after supper and we were sitting in kind of a den area. And he said, you got a guitar? I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, play me something. And so I went and got it, and I said, what do you want me to play? He said, play Cimarron. I said, where do you know that song from? He said, well, it's on the CD that Kurt. Anyhow, Ian turned out to be a huge influence and a helper. You know, I think he kind of believed in me. At the time, he had a TV show, a really popular TV show called Sun Country out of Edmonton. It was filmed in front of a live audience, and it was kind of a Canadian version of Hee Haw, actually. It had a lot of comedy and just that and the other. And he obviously was the star of the show, and he had kind of a sidekick, but they brought in guests, and he said, I want you to come up and do my show. I said, gosh, I'd love to. You know, how do I get there, this, that, and the other? He said, well, I'll have my producer call you. So anyhow, I went up there, and I got a passport and got a visa, and I stayed up there for 2 weeks. The show only took a couple of days to tape, but I stayed with them, and we worked cattle and rode those cutting horses and stuff. And he was very kind, you know. He can be a little bit intimidating, and he'd kind of tell you what he thought of different things you were doing or weren't, but been a very, very important person to me.
In addition to his music career, R.W. has also had a career in acting and has appeared in at least 12 movies since 1985, including Wild Horses, The Tracker, and Gambler 3.
Another time, I had been up in northeastern Nevada on a wild old ranch north of Elko, the IL, and way up there in that old sagebrush country. It was a neat place because it was just a bunch of young cowboys. The wagon boss, I think, was about 22 years old. What a great experience. Well, as it turned out, there was a photographer that I'd met by the name of Bank Langmore. And Kenny Rogers was doing a TV special called Kenny Rogers and the American Cowboy. And it was, I think, like a 90-minute special where they cut from, there was 3 big stars. There was Kenny Rogers, there was Charlie Daniels, and Mac Davis. And so they would alternate between live performances at the Hollywood Bowl or whatever, and then showing these scenes on a ranch. For whatever reason, I wasn't camera shy, so they used me a lot in that. Kenny had a hat. He bought him a brand new hat. It looked like he threw the hat away and was wearing the box, you know. So we went down to this little stream, and I soaked it in water and shaped it for him. And later on, we sat on a log, and I played Ghost Riders in the Sky, and he played Sweet Baby James. And so there just a string of those things started happening. I went back to just doing what I was doing. I think it was 6 years later, the phone rang. I was living down in Lincoln, New Mexico, and there was a man on the phone. He said, my name is Ken Cragen. I manage Kenny Rogers and Lionel Richie and a host of other people. But we're doing a CBS movie of the week. It's a modern-day Western. It's about a wild horse gather. And there's good guys and bad guys. and we were having a production meeting, and Kenny said, let's go back and look at some footage from the TV special we did. And we looked at this footage from the TV special, and there were you and Kenny singing these songs. And Kenny said, I don't know where that kid went, but is there any chance of finding him? That would be cool, if we had a campfire scene in the movie. I still this day don't know. I know that they got a hold of my folks, and my folks gave them my number, and anyhow, probably a week later, Cragen got a hold of me. And he said, would you be interested in doing that? I said, absolutely I would. By then, I was kind of a freelance cowboy. I was doing a lot of, not working for anyone full time, but I was doing a lot of day work. So I'd work for this guy for a month or this person over here for a week or whatever. So it was easy for me to get off. Up to that point, you couldn't ask for time off 6 months in advance. They just kind of say, well, if we're kind of caught up with things, we'll look at it, So I said, yes, I'll be there. That'd be fine. How much time are we talking about? And they said, well, we'll have our people call you, and they'll set you up with plane flights, and figure out where you fly out of, this, that, and the other. And he said, you should plan on maybe 2 or 3 days. And I said, okay. Well, then they called me back and said, well, we got to thinking, we weren't thinking very well, because it's not going to do you any good, not going to do us any good to have you in this one scene of this movie, because you're actually supposed to be with this cowboy crew gathering these wild horses. So you need to be all through the movie. And so I said, well, that would be fine too. How long will that take? And they said, well, if you could do it, it's probably going to take about a month. I said, hey, I'm your man. And by the way, will this pay anything? And they went, I'm sure they laughed, and they said, oh yeah, we'll take care of you. And I did that, and they wrote me into the script, and a guy sent me a DVD. I haven't watched it yet of the movie. I haven't seen it in years. But it's Kenny Rogers, Pam Dalber, who had just gotten off of Mork and Mindy, a guy named Jack Rader that plays a lot of heavies, and then 3 of my favorites, Ben Johnson, Richard Farnsworth, and Buck Taylor, and Gunsmoke had just wound up then. Anyhow, there was all those guys and R.W. Hampton as himself. I was getting old enough, although I wasn't old, but I was getting old enough to realize that probably if I was ever going to have something besides an old broke-down pickup and a crippled horse and a beat-up saddle, that maybe movies and music and those kind of things might be my road to that, and I enjoyed it anyway. And I joined the Screen Actors Guild after that. I had gotten paid to do the show, and then they sent me one more check when they reran it. But they said, the Screen Actors Guild will hold all your residuals unless you join. So I joined. I think it was about $40 or something. But those things just kind of happened. A guy had come through the country named Mike Rutherford, and he had come out to where we were living. We lived south of Clayton, New Mexico, right on the Texas-New Mexico line, down near a little community called Amistad. And he came and took a bunch of pictures, and he said, I'm doing a coffee table book. Would you tell me about some other places I could go, and if you would recommend me, if you would make some phone calls for me? It's interesting because he had been kind of a staff photographer for the Reagan administration. And somehow when Reagan left office, he had started doing a lot of album covers for a lot of the big Nashville acts at the time. But he wanted to do this coffee table book, or some publisher had hired him to do this. And I actually wrote some of the text for it. Anyhow, when this book was released, it was released in Nashville. I had been to Nashville several times, and I had been to the Opry backstage. Charlie Daniels has always been a good friend, and his manager, Dave Corlew, had taken me backstage to meet everybody. That was neat. Meet everybody. I had seen Hank Snow and Charlie Pride and all these different people, and Roy Acuff. But I had an opportunity with the release of the book to be on that night between Charlie Louvin and Connie Smith. That's another story that's just hard for me. It's just like the emotions came flooding back just to step up to that WSM microphone. It's funny because I've tried to get back ever since, and it's been a little bit difficult. I think I'm going to get it done here in the next few months. The manager of the Opry at the time was Hal Durham, and this was in 1990. And so when I walked off stage, he was kind of there to meet me. He said, "Well, I think they liked you." I said, "Well, I sure enjoyed it. I hope they like me because I sure like them." And he said, "You know, I think you're about the first solo Western artist we've had since Marty Robbins passed away." And he passed away in December of '82. And he said, "There's really been kind of a void here. We have Riders in the Sky, but as far as a solo, a person that's not a group." And he said, I think that these folks would like that. But things happened. You know, I had to go home and make a living. Somewhere during that time, country and Western parted ways. And
You remember what songs you played?
I played one of mine called Traveling Light. And they made up a lead sheet for it, and they had the Opry band play it, and it's just kind of a fun little. Well, the day I quit my job to leave this city far behind, I'm all through. I don't remember what key I played that in, but I've got the blue sky above me, a good pony between my knees, everything I own I carry on my back. That's all a cowboy ever needs. I'm riding high, wide, and handsome again, just like the wind. I'm traveling light, wrong chord, see. Well, the day I quit my job to leave this city far behind, I'm all through with trouble and strife. Haven't got a thing to show for what I've done with my life, but I'm not poor, I'm traveling light. I've got the blue sky above me, a good pony between my knees, everything I own I carry on my back. That's all a cowboy ever needs. And I'm riding high, wide, and handsome again, just like the wind. I'm traveling light, something like that, like the wind. I'm traveling light. Anyhow, it's just a fun little song. I haven't played it in years, really. It seemed like I was always circling back to here or that Canadian River country a little bit to the east of here. Cimarron, I wrote when I was 19 years old, and it's just very nostalgic to me. It's a song that really takes me back to that time. I think every young man ought to have a time where he's pretty carefree. And I was cowboying around here. I was working for a ranch called the Red River Ranch. I got off on a Saturday evening, and I thought I might drive into Cimarron and go to the laundromat and do my laundry, maybe see if there's any other cowpunchers in town, and there usually were, and just see where the evening wound up. But I just remember coming in, and I got to a certain place where the country just kind of rolled out. It's just one of them times, you know. I'm not a songwriter, really. I mean, people that write songs, they write all the time. They just write. But I get inspired, and that's when I write something. I'm kind of a lazy writer. And but that was one of those times, even at 19, where I just had to start writing, and I didn't work on it, but it's got a lot of the local names. I was always fascinated with the Spanish names here. There's just such a rich history. I'll just play it. Sometimes it's funny, you can go work too hard trying to explain a song, and I just think, you know what, I'll just sing it. It is like a wild and beautiful woman with the wind blowing through her hair, and it comes to me in my dreams, and I find myself wanting to be there. Cimarron, Cimarron, from you I've been long gone, but I'd know that you were waiting for me to come home, Cimarron. Words like Miranda and Rayado, Sangre de Cristo and Bobian. Words like, do you still love me? And are you coming home once again? Cimarron, Cimarron, from you I've been long gone, but I know that you were waiting for me to come home, Cimarron. As I ride across that old mountain pass, I see you there below, and like a wild and beautiful woman, you beckon me with your soft hello. Cimarron, Cimarron, from you I've been long gone, but I know that you were waiting for me to come home, Cimarron. For me to come home, Cimarron. Oh, Cimarron.
Thanks for playing that for me.
You bet.
And thanks for taking the time to tell me
man.
some of these stories.
Well, the pleasure's been mine. The pleasure has been mine, for sure. I was playing that very ironic because that's the the song that Ian had asked me to play, and you asked me to play it here today.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank R.W. Hampton for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about R.W. at rwhampton.com. I'd like to thank Shooting Star Saddlery for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Shooting Star Saddlery and place orders at shootingstar.montana.com. andyhedges.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying the show and would like to help me keep it going, you can make a donation on my website, or you could take the time to leave a review on the iTunes store and give me a 5-star rating, or you could simply tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.